Who is going to testify against David? In other words, which prosecution witnesses can we expect to take the stand, whether at a preliminary hearing, a trial, both, that will help the state build their case against the accused child murderer? This is a preview of what we can potentially expect. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Real quick, before we go any further, I gotta tell you about this app, our partner, our sponsor. I think you're gonna love it. It is called Upside. Upside gets you cash back. Yes, extra cash back on everyday purchases like gas, groceries, takeout. So here's what you do. You download Upside for free. You claim an offer at one of their 100,000 plus locations. You pay like normal with your card. You verify the purchase, and just like that, money back. So say I need to get gas or I want takeout one night, I'll search for Upside offers first, and after I spend, money appears in my app that I can transfer right into my bank account. And Upside's frequent users earn an average of $254 back a year. So to start getting your cash back, click the link in the description or scan the QR code and make sure to use promo code SIDEBAR because you'll get an extra 25 cents bonus on every gallon on your first tank of gas. So here's a question we haven't fully examined yet. Who will be the potential prosecution witnesses in the David criminal case? You know, the preliminary hearing is set for the end of the month. The actual trial, we'll see when the date is. But remember, preliminary hearing is when the prosecution has to present sufficient evidence, not all their evidence, but sufficient evidence to establish probable cause to support the charges for this case to move forward. But we've talked about 21-year-old David Anthony Burke, how months after 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, her dead, mutilated, decomposed, dismembered body was reportedly found in a Tesla at a Hollywood tow yard, reportedly registered to David. Now, prosecutors charged the singer-songwriter with first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child, and unlawful mutilation of human remains, that he allegedly murdered Celeste to keep her quiet, that they were in an alleged illegal sexual relationship. The narrative is that she was going to expose him, ruin his career, a financially lucrative career, that he allegedly lured her to his place in the Hollywood Hills, lied in wait, killed her. Now, he's entered a not guilty plea. He is innocent until proven guilty, which is why you hear me say allegedly and reportedly so many times, because nothing has been proven in a court of law yet. But I got to talk about this. I got to speculate who the witnesses are going to be, who those people might be to help prove the prosecution's case. First up, obviously, lead detectives on the case. Now, sometimes, particularly in a preliminary hearing, again, where the prosecution doesn't have to present all of its evidence, but enough to establish probable cause for the case to move forward, the lead detectives, the lead investigators, are like the key witnesses. They are the connective tissue. You also see that at trial, too. They connect the start of the investigation to the arrest, analyzing how evidence was collected, how it was processed, who was interviewed. So here, I actually go back to that press conference that was held by LA County District Attorney Nathan Hochman. Remember that press conference from last month? The announcement that David was arrested and what the charges are that he was going to be facing? Well, he said the LAPD detectives on this case are Josh Byers and Corey Farrell. So again, I have to wonder if they're going to testify. And if you look at the prosecution's pretrial brief, they will most likely testify to everything, right? From Celeste's body being found in the Hollywood tow yard in that Tesla, again, allegedly registered to the defendant, to the surveillance footage of David allegedly driving that Tesla at the end of July before he goes on tour, to the Amazon and Postmate purchases of alleged tools to dismember Celeste's body. Remember the shovel, the chainsaws, the laundry bags, the inflatable pool, the body bag, to the Uber records allegedly showing Celeste's movement to David's property on the night that she was supposedly killed. Cell phone activity allegedly tracking David's movements. The Santa Barbara alleged trip to dispose of evidence. I also have to imagine they would testify to the alleged child sexual abuse material on his devices. And they would testify to a lot more. But actually, by the way, to give you an idea of this, going back to the tow yard, remember the main setting, the thing that started this whole case. You go back to the prosecution's brief, it says, quote, on September 8th, 2025, the manager of the tow yard where the Tesla had been impounded noted the strong smell of decay and the presence of flies coming from the vehicle. He notified Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD Hollywood auto detectives who determined the Tesla was registered to defendant through departmental resources. At the tow yard, LAPD detectives opened the Tesla's front storage compartment and observed a black cadaver bag covered in insects Inside the bag, they discovered a severely decomposed head and torso. A plastic garbage bag beneath the black cadaver bag contained the dismembered arms and legs. However, the victim's ring and pinky fingers on her left hand had been amputated and were not found in the Tesla. So this gives you an idea right there of how, whether it's the lead detectives, but in a combination with other detectives, responding officers, what they saw at that scene, how evidence was collected, but also somebody else, right? You can not only see the beginning of their testimony, but you're also going to probably hear from the manager of the tow yard too, as to the apparent smell, the condition of the car. And by the way, you're also going to hear from crime scene technicians and, as I mentioned, responding officers about the evidence collected, how it was preserved as well, because prosecutors, they want to ensure there is a clean chain of custody, that there's no contamination. That would be something that defense attorneys would jump at. Now I got to talk about the medical examiner. Huge witness in this case. Maybe I should say witnesses, actually, because if you go to the death investigation report that was released after it was unsealed, there is the medical examiner investigator, Karen Tapia. There is the deputy medical examiner, Dr. Ansel Nam, the supervisor deputy medical examiner, Dr. Grant Ho, and the forensic technician, Daniel Garcia. Now, I'm not sure all will testify, maybe, but you're essentially talking about these experts or expert testifying about the cause and manner of Celeste's death, her decomposition, her dismembered body. And that is key because, first of all, in any murder case, you have to establish that someone was killed. And it's also going to be key because the defense has indicated that David is not the cause of her death. I've always wondered if the defense is going to present their own forensic pathologist to talk about how you can't definitively determine what happened to Celeste, what her cause of death was. But even if you go to the report that I mentioned, when we talk about what these experts could testify to, quote, death was pronounced at the scene. Autopsy examination was limited by extensive post-mortem changes. There are 2 penetrating wounds of the torso with smooth edges that may represent sharp force injuries. The wound on the upper abdomen penetrates the liver, and the wound on the left chest penetrates one of the left intercostal spaces with disruption of the adjacent ribs' cortical surfaces. The left lung appears intact. The bilateral upper and lower extremities show full thickness dismemberment. Multiple other skin and soft tissue defects are present without apparent associated internal injuries. The etiology of these defects is not clearly apparent due to severe postmortem changes. Postmortem toxicology performed on liver tissue shows the presence of a low level of ethanol, which may be due to postmortem changes or ingestion, and does not appear to be contributory to the cause of death. Given the history and circumstances as currently known by me in the setting of the findings by examination, ancillary studies, and in the absence of other definitive causes of death, the cause of death is multiple penetrating injuries. The manner of death is classified as homicide. You will not have this case without that kind of testimony. And yes, there's also going to be a discussion of how Celeste was reportedly identified through dental records and that tattoo on her hand. And in addition to the detectives and the medical examiners, and you combine their testimony, you're also probably going to have that of certain experts too. For example, you go back to the brief, it says, quote, moreover, defendant took horrifying measures to destroy and discard the victim's body. After placing her body into the blue inflatable pool to prevent her blood from spilling onto his garage floor, defendant used a chainsaw and perhaps other tools to cut off her limbs. Small blue plastic fragments were found embedded in the victim's remains, which were collected by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Department. The fragments were analyzed by the LAPD's Forensic Science Division Trace Analysis Unit. An expert was able to make a physical fit match from the blue fragments to the blue inflatable pool purchased by defendant in May 2025. In order to distance himself from the victim, he amputated her left ring and pinky fingers because her ring finger contained a tattoo of his name. Her fingers have not been recovered. Defendant then placed her head and torso into the cadaver bag he purchased. He placed her limbs into a garbage bag, which he deposited into his front trunk, laying the cadaver bag on top. For several weeks, or possibly months, defendant left the victim's body to decompose inside his Tesla. So, in addition to what I just mentioned before, like the detectives talking about dismemberment and what was allegedly found in the Tesla, and the ME's findings on the body, and also, again, the level of decomposition too, you hear about the fragments being analyzed by a specific LAPD unit. So there you go, a potential other witness. And that goes to other specialized professionals. Like, for example, if I mention DNA, Okay, go back to the brief. The brief says, DNA evidence developed from bloodstains collected from defendant's garage, which match the victim's genetic profile. So now you're talking about a forensic DNA analyst or analysts. Actually, to give you an idea about this, as we talk about experts, I had the privilege to speak to Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator, about Celeste's body, and he said to be on the lookout for these potential experts. Again, maybe witnesses, especially since our understanding is we don't have a precise murder weapon. So take a look at this.
What they do talk about, and this is very important from a forensic standpoint, is that that blade actually passes over the cortex, or the outer layer of the rib. Now, what can we draw from that? Well, you can get a tool mark off of that. And I'm hoping that they retain that sample, because the pathologist goes into some explanation about that piece of rib. All right, and that's something that is commonly done in forensics labs, where once that bit of tissue, that rib, that bone, is cleaned up, it would go to a tool mark examiner, and they'll do a gross examination. That means they're looking at it with an unaided eye. They'll put it on a magnification scope, look at it there, and what they're going to look for is any kind of specific impression that goes across that rib, and they can actually classify the edge that would have created that. Decomposition, though, is going to be the big factor here, I think, and you're going to hear a lot about it. I think you're going to hear a lot about entomology in this case, because this goes back to, and I talked to Steve about this too, the entomology element here is going to be a big part, because, and forgive me, and certainly our listeners too, I don't mean to be insulting or be ghastly here.
It's important to talk about.
But with entomology, flies have a life cycle, okay? And I promise you, dollars to donuts, all right? Within that period of time that she died, I'd say probably within 5 hours, okay? Flies are already aware. So, and there it begins, and flies always find a way. There's nothing you can do to keep away flies. Period. End of paragraph. So what they'll do is that they lay that little clutch of eggs that they all start off with, and that's where this timeline begins to tick, because maggots and flies both have cycles that they run through, and they're kind of set in stone, and that goes to timing, right? So you can have a body where you will have multiple generations of fly. The longer you go out, all right, and the longer there is viable tissue for them to, consume, you're going to have flies. And so what they'll do is the entomologist, and I hope they did this both at the car. Remember, in that statement that was released in that earlier document dump, when they opened that trunk, they observed insect activity there in the trunk, okay? Mm-hmm. My question is, are there any maggot husk or anything indicative of that body being placed somewhere on that property, okay, in the Hollywood Hills? And, with an entomologist, that's an easy lift for them, because they would go out and inspect that area. They would see the husk that are there. That's going to be a big part to that as well. You're also going to see tool mark evidence. The pathologist makes note, they allude, and I'm paraphrasing here, they allude to kind of how cleanly these marks were made. Pathologists can kind of testify to that, but you really want a heavy hitter to come in a tool mark area. I'm just building out the team.
I remember they said multiple linear cuts when it came to the pool, They talked about that.
And then we talk about the dismemberment of the body. Right. You marry that up with that, and these edges are very clean as they can be. And so that I've always felt as though when I heard that, and before I heard the chainsaw that they used, they said this was a chainsaw, I knew that this was going to have to be a mechanical device that was utilized here. This is not, going out to the shed and grabbing your dad's, old carpenter saw.
I know that is not easy to hear. It's never easy to hear. This trial will not be easy. This preliminary hearing will not be easy. And thinking about what her family has to hear if they decide to attend these hearings, Again, something to keep in mind, the human aspect of that, right? Not only talking about the death of a 14-year-old girl, but what authorities say happened to her body. It's hard to comprehend. Again, it is important from a legal point of view to understand this, though, and to understand who could testify. By the way, Joseph also, I'm going to get to this in a minute, he briefly mentions another key witness, potential key witness regarding the actual crime. I didn't even think about this. Keep it in mind, we'll talk about it more in a second. It seems another batch of law enforcement that could potentially testify is not just LAPD, by the way, or experts, but also the Riverside County Sheriff's Department deputies. You remember how Celeste is from Lake Elsinore, right? So again, a big component of this prosecution narrative and the special circumstances allegations is that David allegedly killed Celeste in connection with their illegal sexual relationship, that she was a minor. Remember, he's charged with that sex crime too, continuous sexual abuse. This is from the prosecution's brief. Quote, detectives learned the victim had been reported missing to the Riverside County Sheriff's Department by her family, who live in Lake Elsinore, in February and April 2024. RCSD telephonically contacted defendant, meaning David, on February 17, 2024, after they identified a phone number in the victim's phone records that belonged to him. During the call, defendant claimed he had spoken to the victim last on February 13th or 14th, 2024, but stated he was unaware she was a minor or that she had been reported missing. RCSD advised him that Los Angeles Sheriff's Department deputies would be coming to his home. On that day, defendant was living at 804 North Tahini Place in West Hollywood. RCSD requested that LASD conduct a welfare check at defendant's home. LASD deputies went to defendant's home that night at 8:15 p.m. and informed him the victim was a 13-year-old runaway. Defendant again claimed he was unaware she was a minor and he'd only met the victim once in person in November 2023. However, defendant showed deputies a yearbook photo of the victim he had on his cell phone. Although he claimed to be unaware of where the victim was at the time, she returned home 2 days later. Despite being informed by law enforcement the victim was only 13, defendant continued to pursue her. After the victim returned home in February 2024, her parents took her cell phone away. Defendant drove to Lake Elsinore and paid a junior high school student in the victim's class $1,000 to give the victim a cell phone defendant purchased so they could stay in contact. Throughout 2024, the victim spent a significant amount of time with defendant, including summer weekends, at his home in the Hollywood Hills and traveling with him to Las Vegas, London, and Texas to meet his family. So, I think that aspect of the story from the year before and having Riverside authorities testify, I would expect it. Now, Celeste's family, who I mentioned before, in terms of them being called to testify, they could perhaps explain who Celeste was, the circumstances of her going missing or reportedly running away, or if she provided any information to them about David. I am reminded, though, about how tight-lipped this family has been, understandably so, and what her father, Jesus Rivas, said in a statement that was released by the family attorney, quote, I never had any contact with this guy, and we haven't received any money from him or anyone in his family. So I do also wonder if there's a value to their testimony and whether or not prosecutors even want them to take the stand and potentially be cross-examined by David's attorneys, but we'll see. So I'm not sure whether or not her family would testify. What about David's family? Now, that is an interesting question. Will they testify? Well, in the prosecution's brief, it states, throughout 2024, the victim spent a significant amount of time with defendant, including summer weekends at his home in the Hollywood Hills and traveling with him to Las Vegas, London, and Texas to meet his family. So it is unclear how much David's parents or brother knew about his interactions with Celeste and if they were aware of how young she was. But what we do know is that the family was ordered to come to LA and testify, seemingly in front of a grand jury, as prosecutors worked to build a case against him. Remember, when the Department of Transportation reportedly impounded that Tesla, according to authorities, it was noted that it was registered to David in Hempstead, Texas. We know that his family lives in Texas. And actually, TMZ also later reported that David had transferred deeds of 2 Texas homes to a trust in his mom's name. This came after Celeste's remains were found. Why? Could this be a topic of potential testimony for his family? Maybe. And in court filings regarding this whole back and forth about his family being subpoenaed to testify in LA, there was this section for each witness. Quote, detectives learned that Caleb Burke is the younger brother of target David Burke and has a close relationship with him. Detectives learned that Colleen Burke is the mother of target David Burke and has a close relationship with him. Per several witnesses, she is instrumental to his career success and manages his business finances. So maybe she'll be called to talk about how big was his career? Where was it at the time that Celeste died? You know, what was he going to potentially lose? Something like that. Detectives learned that DeWood Burke is the father of target David Burke and has a close relationship with him. By the way, this is one characterization. I don't know what their actual relationship with him is like, but just something to keep in mind. Then you have this in a court hearing. I want you to listen to what Bennett Dodson, who is the assistant DA for Waller County out in Texas, told the court. Now, again, he's not a prosecutor on this case, but just listen. Quote, "Don't think it's a secret to anyone at this point that Mr. David Burke is a musician who is quite famous, and this matter concerns a car that was registered to him at these witnesses' address here in Houston that had a dismembered, decomposing body in it. I would say if a car with a dismembered, decomposing body is registered to your home address, that is something you should expect to be questioned by the authorities about. And that's what this is, Judge." So you do get the sense of why their testimony could be vital. It does become a question if they would plead the fifth, right, against self-incrimination. Now, I'm not saying they did anything wrong. I'm not saying they did anything illegal. I'm not saying they had any knowledge. But family members testifying in a trial involving one family member accused of murder, how do you not have that conversation? Also, Neil Langston, I'm sure anybody who's been following the story knew I was going to talk about him. A lot of speculation regarding David's purported former friend. I mean, recently we played a video that was obtained by TMZ, apparently from July of 2025, where you can apparently see David and Langston in what appears to be this Hollywood Hills property, this home. And David is on camera seemingly saying the smell, the bad smell, is from him going to the bathroom. Why'd he call it out at that time? And the prosecution's filing, their brief, states that David lied to friends, business associates, and others about the strong smell of decay in and around the home and the car. Is Neil going to be called to testify to that? And here's where it gets complicated too, because it was reported that Neil Langston was arrested in Montana at his mom's house on an LA warrant for failure to appear as a witness. This was several months back. And it was because he allegedly refused to testify, seemingly in front of a grand jury hearing evidence in the David case. And TMZ captured footage of him reportedly seen going in to that LA courthouse when he was eventually brought back. And given the reporting that there was a grand jury that had been hearing evidence in this case for months, you put two and two together again and you say, okay, you probably testified. Here's the thing about that. TMZ reported that he was only in front of that grand jury, if in fact he did testify, for about 30 to 40 minutes. That's it. Now, I'm not sure how much you account the time going into the building and going through security, but seems like an awfully short time for someone that important to testify, who seemingly you needed to be brought back to testify, which is why there are those who have speculated that Neil Langston pled the fifth, right, against self-incrimination. However, to be clear, he hasn't been criminally charged. He hasn't been officially implicated. He has not been accused of having knowledge or participation in anything that David's accused of. And by the way, he took to social media after all this. Instagram story. This post, "Thankfully, I'm legally fine in every way, and boy, do I got all my receipts for things, ha 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 ha." And then he reportedly posted, "I think the worst part is that I've told so many people that I trust and I thought knew me as a person, my side of things, all for that to be thrown out the window as soon as I get arrested and they slap that name next to mine. And for the record, the thing I was arrested for wasn't even charged. They never filed it and my warrant was retracted because there is more to the story than what's on the news." And another question that has come up is whether or not anyone else connected to David has been granted immunity to testify against him. Now, we don't know for sure. I did ask Nathan Hochman, the LADA, on my News Nation show about Neil Langston in the context of, look, I mean, is it possible others can be arrested? The idea of a 20-year-old David committing a brutal murder and dismembering her body and engaging in this cover-up, those are the allegations. If those allegations are true, did he do it all by himself? Did he have help? Now, Hochman told me, again, I'm not going to comment one way or the other about any particular additional individuals or whether there are any additional individuals. What we did with respect to individuals who wanted to either cooperate with our investigation or were uncooperative is that they often receive subpoenas to come in and testify in order for us to get the information to make the decision we made today to file these charges. I do wonder also this, whether David's managers, executives, will they come in to testify? People like Robert Morgenroth or Josh Marshall to testify, yes, about anything they saw or heard in connection with Celeste, alleged relationship, anything like that. I mean, TMZ reported that with respect to Morgenroth, they reportedly heard in the hallway of the courthouse that Morgenroth said at one point during a grand jury proceeding, again, this was the report, that the deputy DA, Beth Silverman, who we know is now prosecuting this case, that he says in the hallway, quote, "She was very pushy on why I didn't call police." So that's one thing. But I also want to know if they're going to be called to testify to David's lucrative career. Remember, authorities claim that David killed Celeste for financial gain. So, with respect to his tour and the album and how he was tracking on social media and streaming, I talked about his mom, but could they be called too? This idea that David was highly successful, that prosecutors need to establish that. In fact, in the pre-trial brief, when they list out the potential evidence, prosecutors say, proof of defendant's lucrative career as a singer and songwriter prior to April 23, 2025. Defendant had an album release party on the night of April 24, 2025, before embarking on an international tour in late July 2025. And remember, they say he killed her April 23, 2025. There's also this, quote, text message exchanges between defendant and the victim on April 22nd and April 23rd, 2025, where the victim threatened to expose defendant and destroy his career. And then there's this, April 23rd, 2025 is the likely date of the victim's death, and when all her cellular activity ceased the night prior, April 22nd, 2025, defendant and the victim engaged in a lengthy argument described in detail in their text messages. The messages reveal the victim's jealousy over defendant's relationships with other women. As defendant led her to believe they had a future together, she became extremely upset and threatened to disclose damaging information about her relationship with defendant to end his career and destroy his life. Defendant's first studio album was due to be released on April 25th, 2025. He had an emerging multi-million-dollar career already in progress. He also had multiple product endorsements, which were highly profitable. And again, I also have to imagine that the lead detectives will get into that too, a part of his career. I think that's going to be a huge part. Oh, and by the way, I just have to say this. When we talk about text messages and cell phone records, usually, if we're talking witnesses, digital forensics examiners will be called to authenticate the cell phone extractions. They could be called to testify. Celebrite, for example. Now, to be clear, I'm not laying out every potential witness that we may hear in this case. I don't know the full investigation. But it does lead me to one final potential witness that, again, I didn't even think about, but my good friend, Joseph Scott Morgan, oh, he sure did. You go back to the brief. It says, knowing he had to silence the victim before she ruined his music career as she had threatened, very soon after her arrival at his home, defendant stabbed the victim to death multiple times and stood by while she bled out. In no time did he call law enforcement or 911 or take her to an emergency room to attempt to save her life. How do they know that he did that? Well, we look at the timing of when she arrived. No more activity, allegedly from her phone, and then he allegedly sent her a text 20 minutes after her arrival about where is she. So they say it's an alibi text used to cover his tracks. You know, they say there was no call to 911, so they might be assuming here. Or listen to Joseph.
Yeah, but back to that earlier point, how do they know that he stood there? Because, look, I got to tell you, as an old investigator, you know where I get that kind of information from? It's not from the perpetrator. To say someone stands there and watches an individual bleed out, that comes from a witness. And that's the one thing that's left me scratching my head over all of this. You know how? Because that is a huge leap. If you're talking about an investigative descriptor, that is such a leap to make that affirmative statement, because I can tell you when their feet are put to the fire relative to any kind of trial that's going to come about, that question is going to be asked and it is going to have to be answered. You said in the report right here that he stood there while she bled out. So unless they have internal cameras that bore witness to this, unless there was something that was caught on a Tesla, you know, that's the only other path I can really go down relative to that.
Unless they're just assuming this based on the idea of, look, we can say multiple penetrating wounds, right? I believe that's what they said the cause of death was, and they're saying we're putting two together, right? She allegedly came to the house at this time. We know that he allegedly sent a text to her phone 20 minutes later. We believe a sharp instrument was used, and so we are saying, of course, he stabbed her, and if he stabbed her, of course, he just waited for her to bleed out because he allegedly never called 911 or authorities, and so that's what they're assuming. But you're saying, in your experience, they shouldn't or wouldn't make that statement. There was no need to make that statement unless they have some sort of information.
Yeah, man, it's just such a huge leap, you know, to go down that road. For me, and I'm going to tell you, that is going to have to be revealed in court. And you know as well as anybody that you cannot just kind of in some kind of pedestrian manner, just go by and say, yeah, well, this is what happened. You're going to have to explain that. I mean, because people are going to want to know. This is arguably one of the most gruesome things that we've covered in some time. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter what people think, but I think that even the court is going to want that explained. If defense looks at this and said, how do they know that? They can't just say, well, we just know. They're going to have to lay that down, the facts, right? Just like in forensic science, we like to deal with the facts. We like to deal with those absolutes. When you get inside the courtroom, you have to state the facts of the case. And this is what they're saying is a fact of the case. So I'm going to be fascinated to see how this is explained because I don't know, man. Inquiring minds want to know, right?
There you go. So a review of potential witnesses in the David case. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. You can also check us out on NBC's Peacock as well. If you want to follow me, X, Instagram, my News Nation show, Jesse Weber Live, Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. Eastern. See you next time, everybody.